Broadband Breakfast Live Online. My name is Drew Clark. I'm the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very excited to welcome all of you here today for our live online event on Wednesday, May 19th. And one of the reasons I'm so excited for this event, this is the third of our fourth explainer or Ask Us Anything events. So it's a little bit different from our normal format, where normally we have multiple guests and we hear from kind of the clash of ideas. And then we, obviously have a lot of discussion through chat windows and sometimes on camera as well. And that we'll be returning to that format as you'll hear, not only next month, but we've got a special event coming up next week for all of you as well. But the other point I wanted to make here is that I'm very excited because not only are we going to have a special event next week on Section 230, the debate over it, we are later this week launching the Broadband Breakfast Broadband Breakfast Club membership. And so this launch will be happening this week on Broadband Breakfast, and you'll be able to learn more about it and take advantage of the founders launch through the whole month of May and June. And I want to introduce Emily McPhee, who is our development associate at Broadband Breakfast. Why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit, Emily, and say a word or two about the Broadband Breakfast Club launch that we're going to be doing this week.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Emily, and I'm very excited about this membership launch. We have several exciting products that are going to be happening, including exclusive features and columns, weekly members-only webcasts, invitations to special in-person events, discounts to other events, and more. So I think it'll be a really exciting product. And for this first month and a half, there's a special founding members launch rate. So it's going to be a fun thing to see where it goes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily. And you'll be seeing and hearing more from Emily next week and in future weeks as well. For now, I certainly want to encourage those of you who want to know more and stay informed about the Broadband Breakfast Club launch to go ahead and type in chat, type in club, as in Broadband Breakfast Club in the Zoom window, or if you're watching on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, any of our other platforms, feel free to type the same, type in the word club in Zoom or in the other platforms, and we'll make sure that you are the first to know about information pertaining to the Broadband Breakfast Club launch this week. So let's turn now to our topic at hand. We're going to be talking today about spectrum, radio frequency spectrum. And just as with the last week and last 2 weeks, I've got a presentation that I will be sharing here. Just again, bear with me as I get the screen share right so that you can see what you need to see. This will be about 10 minutes, hopefully. Hopefully not too much more or less. And then we are going to take all of your questions about radio frequency spectrum, including spectrum sharing. And we'll have a special guest to talk about that with us here. So let's go ahead and remember, if you're interested in the club, go ahead and hit the club in the chat window for Zoom or any of the other platforms that we're live on. So let me go ahead and launch the slideshow and the screen share. And all right. Is everyone seeing the screen share okay? Just give me a thumbs up or a yes in the chat window, and I will know that we have a good view. Thank you so much. So this is just a little bit about me. I'm Drew Clark, the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. I'm also of counsel of the Com Law Group. And I should mention, as I do every week, that this is not a legal presentation There's no attorney-client privilege created by it, and I certainly encourage you to explore legal services for those things you need. There's no need to assume that for this presentation here. And a little bit about the areas I work in: fiber-based and fixed wireless providers on commercial contracts, regulatory classifications, broadband mapping issues, and spectrum licenses and waivers, as well as mergers and acquisitions. And there's the link to my full legal bio. So now, continuing, we're going to be talking today about spectrum sharing in particular, right? And for this discussion, and indeed on the page that you could register for this event, you were able to watch a short video and read an explainer that we put out there on some of the issues with spectrum sharing and some of the differences and controversies surrounding it. And again, just sort of stepping way back, we like to say there's no stupid questions because this is a complicated area. It's always changing by the innovation and new technologies, and so we want to kind of cover those and hear the questions that each of you have as part of this process. So spectrum, of course, refers to electromagnetic spectrum, the radio waves. It is a finite resource, although I do note that we keep discovering new uses for technologies, and that in some ways kind of expands it. And Hertz obviously is a wave cycle, and so a Hertz is a unit or frequency that is measured, and the Hertz is that unit. So megahertz, gigahertz, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz. As most of you probably know, obviously the radio dial, the AM radio dial is kilohertz, and the FM radio dial is megahertz. So 99.1 is 99.1 megahertz. That's the frequency at which the radio or TV radio, in this case, broadcasts are made at. So continuing, the Federal Communications Commission manages non-federal uses of spectrum and has for almost 100 years, 94 years, we're coming up on the anniversary of the Federal Radio Commission, 1927, and that commission is in some ways a precursor to the Federal Communications Commission. There's other precursors too. Interstate Commerce Commission can also be viewed as a precursor, but the FCC since 1934 has managed non-federal uses of the airwaves, and those in some ways are very significant, but there's also very significant federal use of the airwaves, and those uses are managed by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the agency within the Commerce Department. And so, this is somewhat unique globally in that the U.S. has these, two separate managers of spectrum usage. We're going to again talk now about licensing versus unlicensed, but maybe we will also get to some of the ways that those strict breakdowns, those strict categories have broken down a little bit, right? The licensing model, which is a model we've had from the beginning in a way, in that there is a licensed use at a particular frequency that has kind of gotten attached and associated with the more property rights style usage of airwaves that we've experienced since we began the auctions of radio frequency spectrum in 1993. The auctions kicked off a process that enables us in some ways to think of airwaves as a property right, but as a result, there's a kind of an expense component to licensed use of the airwaves. Unlicensed spectrum are those areas on the spectrum dial that if you comply to particular uses, you are permitted to broadcast without the need to go get a license from the Federal Communications Commission or any entity. And I should note, of course, there's no state regulation of the airwaves. It's purely a federal matter, and that's just coordinated exclusively at the federal level by either the FCC or the NTIA. So this unlicensed use, and this is kind of where I'm turning to to the explainer we published on our site just a bit ago, where we talk through this very issue and we highlight the key bands. Most people know the bands, the Wi-Fi bands, being significant places for unlicensed use, the 2.4 and the 5.8 gigahertz. Again, 5.8 gigahertz is 5,800 megahertz, which of course is 5 million kilohertz, but we don't do that. We just focus on the point on the dial. And I should just note, this is again in the nature of kind of dumb questions or dumb answers. Megahertz and gigahertz are used as both a unit of measurement and a point on the spectrum dial. It's super confusing for people who don't live and breathe this stuff. And so our nomenclature, and I believe this is also the FCC's, although it's not universal, is to always capitalize gigahertz or megahertz when we're talking about the spot on the dial. But at the 5.8 gigahertz band, there's going to be 0.6 gigahertz of spectrum available, right? So there's a measurement that also relates to the amount or the place that it's on the dial. Okay, so back to the unlicensed bands. There's unlicensed bands in 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, 5.8 gigahertz, and 24 gigahertz. Those are some of the major unlicensed bands in the United States. So spectrum sharing takes place not only in the unlicensed bands, but there's also forms of spectrum sharing that takes place in licensed bands. That sort of spectrum sharing is not typically thought of as spectrum sharing, but it is sharing nonetheless. And there's a coordination going on where the managers of the spectrum make use of the particular protocols that they want to use for the sharing of spectrum in those areas they can control. So when we talk about spectrum sharing in this sense, we're talking now about how multiple users operate within the same band. And there's been a lot of attention on CBRS and C-band, which we'll get to and talk a little more about here today, being areas where there's a combination of a large-scale unlicensed use and increasingly priority use. So priority use is designated by tiers. This is speaking about the CBRS and upwards towards the C-band. General Authorized Access, Priority Designation, the Priority Access License is something called PALs, and then there are incumbents in this spectrum band, longtime users in the band, and the Navy plays a key role in this band. There's also issues that we've reported on dish networks and their support for spectrum sharing, and how acting FCC Chairman Jessica Rosenworcel has supported more sharing-based initiatives in these areas around CBRS band. The proponents of sharing argue that other models don't provide sufficient solutions to growing demands for spectrum. Those who argue for flexible exclusive use, while again having a large foothold in the United States, are counter that there's less peril of interference when there's a clear title, if you will, right? Don't want to buy a house with bad title, with cloudy title. You want clear title to your spectrum, just like you want clear title to your real property in your house. And these proponents also argue that the sharing can devalue the bands, that interference makes service worse, and flexible and exclusive use will be sufficient to accommodate 5G. So that actually raises a great point about 5G. All right. Now, we've talked a lot. We've had a whole series here at Broadband Breakfast Live Online on the so-called fifth generation 5G wireless. And there's both a technological advancement and there's in fact, there's many technological advancements to 5G, from speed to new forms of spectrum sharing, and that's kind of raised a lot of attention to this issue. So I'm going to introduce a special guest for our discussion here, and I will show the panel here. This is Benjamin Kahn. He's one of our reporters here at Broadband Breakfast. He is been focusing on wireless and spectrum issues for the last 3 months or more. And you can see all of his stories at this URL, a little bit about him. Thanks for being with us, Ben. Very happy that you've been able to join us. Let me go ahead and stop my sharing and put you in the view as well. So Ben, tell us a little bit about some of the issues that you've reported on, and in particular, the issue of how 5G and the spectrum sharing views have been playing out in terms of the Federal Communications Commission and the issues that you focused on in some of your report on this topic.
Thanks.
Ben, I can't hear you right now. I don't know if you've gone on mute or bad connection here.
No, I'm unmuted. It must be my connection.
I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So like I was saying is that, 5G is kind of what's been at the tip of everyone's tongue recently, and will continue to kind of be at the forefront of a lot of discussions, both domestically and internationally, for the foreseeable future as it continues to roll out. One of the discussions that is talked about a lot is the race for 5G. So the idea that it's kind of this adversarial position where we're in a competition with other international players like China, like Western Europe, all these other countries that are developing their infrastructure to be able to support 5G networks. One of the ways that, like you just mentioned earlier, Drew, one of the actions that was taken recently was when the FCC approved the deployment of hardware to American territories. The environmental sensing capability hardware that was developed, that was placed in these territories, is designed to help facilitate automatic dynamic spectrum sharing. And this is going to be the FCC, and particularly Chairwoman Rosenworcel, argue that this is going to be necessary to facilitate broader 5G rollout, to be able to have more services operating in the finite space that we have with spectrum. That's one of the many actions that they've kind of taken.
Great, thank you very much. We're starting to get some questions in here, and we encourage more. We encourage your expertise. I want to also point out that we call this "Ask Us Anything" because we want to encourage you to ask us. Not a promise that we're going to answer everything, okay? Either because of lack of knowledge or because there's some things that can't be handled completely. We have a question here from Mark Snarzecki. I hope I've got that right. Mark's question is, how does the robust act by WNC Broadband's legislator, Representative Madison Cawthorn, play into today's topic? So, Mark, I'm going to go ahead and invite you to turn on your camera, and I want you to elaborate a little bit more on your question here. Is this act in the state of North Carolina, or can you give us a little more information about this and how it ties into the spectrum discussion, Mark?
Yes, most certainly, Drew. Thank you. On Monday, House Republican Madison Cawthorn introduced a new bill called the Robust Act, asking major broadband players to make available broadband spectrum for the use and benefit of wireless internet service providers, is what I understand. It sounds like the big guys are holding spectrum and for rural broadband and the needs of wireless internet service providers. This seems to be an opportunity.
So, Ben, have you heard about this yet? We probably want to get on it if we haven't, but there's obviously lots of issues, and let me just back up a second here for a second, Mark. The Biden administration's broadband principles, which were unveiled, I believe, March 31st, put forth some key objectives for broadband infrastructure legislation. They didn't go into details, even to the point of not spelling out technologies, not spelling out speeds, although there's a kind of a sense that we need to have higher and higher speeds, and there's a lot of question about, well, what is this going to mean when it gets translated into legislative language? And people have been saying, well, is this Biden bill going to get captured through this measure or that measure? So the bill that Representative Cawthorn has introduced, it looks like just this week, Mark, would apparently include some measures to promote spectrum. Now, let me just say one thing, okay? So I haven't heard of this yet, so I'm just saying that we'll have to follow up on this. But there have been obviously lots of discussion about spectrum as part of the push for broadband. And one bill that kind of constantly comes up again and again, spectrum and broadband, is sort of forcing the federal government to account for and almost budget for its use of the airwaves, right? And so this is a bill that Senator Mike Lee has introduced several times, and the goal, if you will, is to maybe attach an opportunity cost for the federal government's use of spectrum, because that's always a push where wireless providers want to get access to, i.e., to bid on at auction some spectrum, and that's kind of the process we've seen. I mean, even CBRS, in a way, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, is a way in which spectrum formerly just used by one service. There's the military component, the Navy component, and there's also incumbent satellite operators that have used a portion of the span. And it's a way to accommodate very different uses of spectrum. That's kind of maybe one key. And maybe, Ben, you could speak a little bit more about the point about sort of sharing with incumbents in some of the stories you've written.
Yeah, sure. I can touch on that. I also just wanted to elaborate on the bill that was proposed by Representative Cawthorn. Obviously, it's still very new. I believe he just put it forward on the 17th. But in any case, it seems to be somewhat aligned with some of the talking points. I can't speak specifically to some of the items in the bill, but he's spoken a lot about incentivizing cooperation with local municipalities and with local smaller providers. And that's kind of aligned with what we saw Shirley Bloomfield yesterday when she testified before the
Mention who she is, Ben.
Yeah, sure. So, excuse me. So Shirley Bloomfield is the CEO of the NTCA, and she provided testimony at the Senate Finance Committee yesterday and laid out 6 points. And I believe it was her 6th point was actually encouraging local cooperation. Encouraging consumers to look local for their broadband and spectrum needs. And so this, like I said, I can't speak to necessarily all the specifics in the bill, but I can say that just by, from a cursory look, it does appear that this is somewhat aligned, at least on the face of it, with some of the recommendations that were put forward by the NTCA.
Thank you for your question, Mark. Let's invite you to take your camera off. And we have a great question here from Scott Slater here. Can you comment on the CAA, and this is the Competitive Carriers Association, I think CCA instead of CA, request for the Federal Communications Commission to consider higher power rules for CBRS and what that implies for shared spectrum. Scott, if you're willing, we'd love to have you elaborate on that a little bit, either on camera or in the chat window. Great, thank you. Thank you for popping on, Scott. Great to see you, and thank you for joining this discussion. Why don't you introduce yourself and some of the things you've been doing in the context of this question, Scott?
So if you're not familiar with the CBRS specifications right now, in the US, the power parameters for CBRS will support indoor unlicensed spectrum sharing, but it's not sufficient enough to support outdoor unlicensed, and because CBRS is delivering mobility, this is of interest, I think, to a lot of companies and to a lot of businesses. And we're the only country that has this lower power bandwidth specification currently for CBRS deployment. So curious to get some consensus and thinking about that application and then how other people feel about it.
Well, wonderful. Ben, do you want to comment on this issue of power levels? And then I can take a stab at it too.
Yeah, I would say that I'm probably, power levels is something that I still am learning about, something that I don't want to comment on right now, just because I don't want to give you any inaccurate information, but this is something that I will definitely have at the top of my radar, so to speak, to become more accustomed with and more familiar with.
So there's obviously two or more categories of the CBRS uses, right? The priority access licenses that can transmit at higher powers than those who have general access licenses. Scott, do you have some thoughts on the request that the Competitive Carriers Association is putting out here? What do you think it implies for shared spectrum?
Well, thanks, Drew. Appreciate the softball. Well, I think it's clear that having a higher power requirement for CBRS will inspire more adoption of shared spectrum for private networks and for enterprises locally. If the limit is maintained, then you're competing against Wi-Fi in-building capabilities. And Benjamin, to your comment, the element about power relates directly to something we call link budget, right? Which is how far can that signal travel, and can it effectively travel through walls? And so the value of CBRS is clear for businesses who have and enterprise that have property and large areas they want to cover. I think it makes a lot of sense that those specifications be changed. One, that so there'll be a global baseline, and two, so that there'll be businesses that have a variety of needs, not just in building, to provide capabilities that's more economically attractive than what's currently available for them.
Thank you very much, Scott, and very, very excited to have you on this discussion and to hear from some of the very interesting things going on in this space. I just put a link into another piece that we published in Broadband Breakfast about some of the many developments in this shared spectrum space. This is a year and a half ago, but there's a lot that's still updated, or that's still relevant, I should say, in it. And in particular, it walks through some of the issues surrounding the CBRS, okay, and what was emerging then and has now taken place in terms of an auction that took place last year for the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, the C-band, okay, and a similar situation, right, with auction, and then the educational broadband service, which operates at the 2.5 gigahertz bandwidth. And again, we strive to stay abreast and keep informed about these developments so that people can have that resource through Broadband Breakfast. I want to take now a question here that Bruce Wolf has raised, and Bruce points to an article from a few years back, quite a few years back, about the 2008 auction involving, I think this was the 700 megahertz band. Now, I won't particularly focus on the article there, but Bruce points out Google's entry into this system of auctioning, and in some ways this was the kickoff, 2008, of some efforts to get this kind of shared spectrum effort throughout coming bands, if you will, right? And so what we've seen since that time is the authorization, the approval of the spectrum, the SAS, the spectrum administrators, and what those spectrum administrators have their role. And there's I think there's been 5 of them that have been authorized by the FCC. They are Amdocs, CommScope, Federated Wireless, Google, and Sony. And so those 5 spectrum access system administrators play a role in detecting transmissions from Defense Department radar systems or from Earth to space systems that satellite companies use. And then if you are operating in the CBRS band, you, through the SAS direction, it's all handled magically through software and through the tools and the equipment, then it turns off the transmission and shifts to another portion of that band for that moment. So that and Google has been, as one of the 5 SAS administrators, has been kind of an adopter and a promoter of that approach, that technology, for some time. So Bruce, I don't know if I've gotten a little bit at your question, right? Because the article is promoting a theory here about Google that I don't necessarily agree with or know enough to agree with, but you are kind of pointing to something that I wanted to highlight, how that approach to spectrum sharing kind of has emerged over the last several years. Do you or others on our call want to speak about this system any further? Just reply in the chat window or come online if you'd like to. We will continue to take your questions. All right. So I appreciate all of you being here, and we're really happy to continue this discussion for the hour here. I want to turn to Ben for a moment and talk a little bit about some of the trends and maybe the sort of the different industry-based approaches to the use of airwaves with regard to spectrum, or with regard to some of the other spectrum sharing, or with regard to some of the other issues involved in spectrum. Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the interesting developments that we've kind of been looking at over the past couple of weeks has been this push for to re-examine the rules associated with the 12 gigahertz spectrum, and I'm trying to find my words, and the spectrum sharing policies in that band and opening it up, and kind of an interesting development. I won't speculate on their motives for it, but it was interesting to see that. So Dish Services is one of the primary users of the 12 gigahertz band. I believe it's like upwards of 20% is occupied by Dish and Dish Services. And they, made it very clear in a press release that they welcomed the notion of sharing, which is not always a common reaction to something like that. A lot of incumbent providers or services like to be able to lock down a part of the spectrum and not have to worry about sharing it with anyone else. And so, they caught some flack from other people suggesting that they had ulterior motives or whatever. But like I said, I won't speculate on that. But it is just interesting to see that Dish is adopting this very receptive posture And it will be interesting to kind of keep an eye on that and see how that develops over the next couple of weeks and months.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for being willing to come on and join me in the ask us anything challenge here. We got a question earlier on from Todd Peterson. He asks about, can you talk about Freedom Fi and Magma open source as a possible solution for 5G deployment? I am not personally familiar with Freedom Fi and Magma. I want to kind of use that to talk about the trend towards Open RAN, right? And I'll, again, give Ben the first chance to talk to Open RAN and some of the developments there. What is an open radio access network, and why are we seeing so much focus on it right now? Ben, if you'd be willing to take a stab at that, and I'll elaborate a little further.
Yeah, sure thing. So once again, this kind of drags us back to what I mentioned earlier, which is this race for 5G and this kind of adversarial position that we have with players like China, and specifically with people who are part of the supply chain, Huawei. And so Open RAN refers to Open Radio Access Networks, which is essentially it is a movement to disaggregate, or excuse me, to make generic all the different various components that are involved in radio networks. So that's everything from silicon chips to everything that's involved in that, making it all generic so that these are things that could be it will broaden the supply chain and make it easier to, and what we've seen over the course of the pandemic is a serious kind of constraint on the supply chain. We've been hurting to get these necessary components, and it's really held us up in the deployment of 5G. And so right now there's only a few manufacturers of these critical components. And so the idea is that by making it generic, you open the market, you increase competition, and the argument is that it will allow us to perhaps, beat, as it were, China in the race to 5G, and be less dependent on any of the components that would be coming out of China or around the world. We'd actually be able to manufacture them, perhaps even domestically.
So thank you for that. One of the big, discussion points around 5G networks, as we've talked about in previous Broadband Breakfast Live Online events, is the faster speeds that are enabled by 5G networks, and some of that is through the technological standard, and others is by virtue of more distributed transceivers, transmitters, and receivers in the network. And so you're having both, changes in standards for transmission, and also, greater number of access points and the distribution of signals through those access points. And I, it's amazing to me to see how quickly we've turned to, it's almost like a space race, right? Us against China, and we were seeing this global, warfare. Commercial warfare, not military warfare, fortunately, around whose equipment is going to be in the networks. There's a lot of sense, a lot of talk in American telecommunication circles that Huawei benefited by really getting a lot of the LTE market share, the 4G wireless technology, and that's just enhanced their market position globally. And in the last 2 years, we've seen just a huge pushback on, not just pushback, a hammer back. There's no way you can use federal funds any longer for Huawei equipment, and there's massive amounts of money that's been committed to rip and replace Huawei gear out of networks. And the major telecommunications manufacturers besides Huawei that operate, core components of the network are, Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung, right? So all operating from democratic nations, but still none of them American per se. So that kind of lends a bit of an air of uncertainty and kind of a national security / supply chain component to this discussion of telecommunications equipment and how it impacts 5G. There's also been discussion about making sure, again, this 5G becomes another impulse and impetus for more spectrum being auctioned off, right? That's the way the dynamic runs most of the time. We need to catch up globally. We need to keep up or catch up or go faster than other countries. And that's going to happen if we have more spectrum available. And in general, that's absolutely true. We need more spectrum to make sure that the demand for wireless networks can be satisfied. And where we're seeing some degree of pushback is entities that are not reliant or dependent upon licensed spectrum, wanting to have an opportunity to build and run businesses off of unlicensed spectrum. Indeed, most of the wireless internet service providers out there that are offering service are offering it using unlicensed bands. The 2.4, the 5.8, the 12 gigahertz band. There's an increasing number that are using CBRS or the Priority Access license, and so you almost have a bit of a clash of cultures and approaches to the use of spectrum in those networks. We're going to keep it open for another few minutes here. Who else has a question on our audience about spectrum that you could ask of myself or of our reporter Ben Kahn? We are, like I said, building off of some videos we posted on the site, and also the explainer that we posted. This was the second explainer we did. We did one last week on net neutrality. We intend to do another one in the coming week on Section 230 in preparation for our discussion and our debate next week on that topic. While we're waiting another minute or two, I'm going to go ahead and Ben, invite you to kind of turn your camera off. I'm going to tell our audience a little bit more about the Broadband Breakfast Club membership that we'll be launching this week. So as Emily mentioned at the top of the hour, those who subscribe to the Broadband Breakfast Club membership at our founders launch rate will be able to get exclusive features and columns, members only webcasts. Okay, so we're doing this. It's a public webcast, and we intend to continue with this, but we will also be focusing in on specific subjects that are interest to you, to our members, and also we'll be offering invites and discounts on some key broadband related conferences and events that are coming up, including the Broadband Breakfast Club, which we plan to launch this year, the in-person Broadband Breakfast Club. And I just encourage you to sign up for our and stay connected to us through our newsletters, through our social media channels. We're available on Twitter and Facebook, of course, Zoom. And if you have any particular interest, we will be happy to get back to you with the latest if you type in club in the Zoom window or in the Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube window. Admitting one more person to our meeting here, we'll give this person a chance to see if he would like to offer any questions. But we are, again, very excited to have next week our discussion debate on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Communications Decency Act, of course, no longer exists, but Section 230 does exist. And that debate will be, I will not be hosting, but we will have a great moderated debate on the subject of 230, changes, keep or get rid of, and how we deal with it. We are going to wrap up. I appreciate everyone's being with us here and offering your comments and questions for this third of our Ask Us Anything events. Very excited to see you next week on May 26th for our Section 230 debate. And we will be back again in June, the first Wednesday in June, with more special content focused on Broadband Breakfast Live Online's upcoming Digital Infrastructure Investment Summit. So with that, I'm going to thank everyone for being with us, for spending this time with us, and we'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care.